Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to my channel. This is my part 11 of the Andalusicans. We are in the lands of the northern frontier. I'm just going to get on with it. If you're a first time comer, please subscribe. If you're not a first time comer, obviously you know the drill. And if you haven't seen my previous videos, please do so. The consolidation of the Umayyads' power in the south and centre of the Iberian Peninsula had not so far extended to the north. Here the pact was much more negotiation with independent portions than imposing Umayyad authority. The picture was complicated by the presence of independent Christian powers to the north and complex interactions between them and the northern Muslim powers. And it is worth examining the changing nature of relationships between Cordoba and the north in the region of Hisam I and Akhaman I and Abdul al-Rashid II. In the western part of the peninsula, the Tunisian Muslims' frontier remained relatively stable. There were repeated raids by both sides in the no-man's lands that divided the two sides, but Muslim settlements did not advance beyond the Calderon centre, and the Christian kingdom of Asteria was confined to the northern mountains. Though Christians did manage to hold on perilously to some outposts at the northern edge of the plains, like the old Roman fortress at Lyon and Astorag. Further, each local Christian, with some support from the Carolinians, were able to take over Girona in 785 and Barcelona in 801, whilst in 799 Pamplona was taken by the Basques and gradually became the nucleus of the new kingdom of Navarre. Barcelona and Gigoria were incorporated into the Carolinian Empire and became the centre of the Spanish March Hispania. The early 9th century saw further Carolinian attacks as the Franks attempted to follow up the conquests of Barcelona with other gains. According to the Frank sources, Louis the Pious, the king of Aquitaine, made 3 attempts to conquer Torreras in 804, 808 and 809. Arab sources mention expeditions in 808 and 809, but Torreso was successfully relieved by Abdullah Rashid and Amaras B. Yusuf, and Frankish power was halted. From this point, Muslim control was limited to the Ibron Plains, with Toulouse, Hussein, Liran and Torres being the most northern significant settlements. The frontier of 801 remained essentially unchanged in this area for the next 300 years. So this is the point where the Muslim world decided this is about as far as we're going to go. The effort necessary to do it would have damaged Andalusia. And remember, at this point, Andalusia wasn't formally part of the rest of the Muslim empire, which would have been at this point the Abyssinians. Or was it the other ones? I can't remember, to be quite honest. Unlike the Christians, the Muslims made no substantial territorial gains, but they launched numerous raids on Christian lands. These usually took the form of Siefa, a summer expedition. The raids could be directed at Galicia, the Lyon area of Barcelona, and perhaps the most common objective was the area of Alver and the district that the Muslim authorities began to refer to as Alquileia, the lands of castles, which was later to become the nucleus of Old Castile. These raids were not, as far as we can tell, annual events, but varied between periods of intense activities, spells when they are not expeditions records at all. Hisam I, in keeping with his policy of Islamic leadership, sent numerous expeditions between 791 and 795, but his successor Al-Hakim I, perhaps because he was preoccupied by internal dissent, was much less energetic. Abdul al-Rashid II sent expeditions in 823, 825 and 826, but theirs was a long gap until 835, when intermittent raids were resumed until the end of his reign. Direct raids against the Christians was, in both eastern and western Islamic lands, an important sign of leadership and authority over the Muslim community, and their purpose was as much ideological as military. Under Hisam, the raids were usually led by one of the Benu Mugatai brothers, Abdul al-Malik, Abdul al-Karim and Abdul al-Wahid. This was continued until Al-Kahim and into the reigns of Abdul al-Rashid II, which the Umayyad Ubayd Ali b Ab Allah al-Bassanas also promoted. When raids were resumed after 838, they were a marked difference. They were not led by members of the Amir's immediate family, including his brothers Salid and Umayyad, and later his sons Al-Masis, Al-Mutfa Mahimid, and Al-Murad. In 840, the Emir himself, Abdul al-Rashid II, led an expedition, the only time the ruler participated in person. We have no details, but the fact that this experiment was not repeated suggests that it may not have been a success. The Saif was clearly being used at this time to enhance the prestige of the ruling family and to give the princes both experience and useful contacts. Once again, Andalusian practiced reflect Eastern model. So the raiding was generally used to keep the Christians off balance and to give the Muslim combat abilities, because the Christians wanted these lands back. They were more than happy to fight for them. They were more than happy to throw away their use for it. This is a much more bloody and warlike age than we live in today. Regardless of what you might think on the common television, medieval ages were absolutely blood and death. There were no intentions of conquering the Christian north, though attempts were made to regain lost lands like Pamplona and Barcelona, where the Leonese abandoned their city when faced by the Mongols of the Muslims in 846. The conquerors simply made breaches in the walls and then left the site abandoned. Of course, it was soon reoccupied and fortified again by the Christians. Destruction and booty were the main objectives. Other the pickings from these impoverished and underdeveloped areas must have been quite limited. The one major expedition beyond the Pyrenees in this period, when Abdul al-Malik bin Mughrad defeated the Count of Toleras near Castellón in 793. Many have been more rewarded, and we are told of vast amounts of booty and slaves being taken. Other typically it failed in its primary objective of retaking Girona. Each of the marches along the northern frontier of Al-Andalus had a different physical and human geography. The lower marches were centred on the open plains and wide landscapes of Extremadura. Apart from the capital of the old Roman city of Merida, it was largely rural area where scattered castles and fortified villages were the only settlements inhabitants. Few Arabs lived here, and the bulk of the population, political active population, were Bebians and powerful Melwarian landowners. Most of the Bebians were probably semi-nomadic or transhumanic pastoralists, and tribal structure survived here for longer than in most settled areas. Tribal chiefs exerted power through the Umayyad period in the late 8th century. The most important figure was the chief Absul bi Wasan Mekarat, who, supporting Hisman against the claims of his brother Suleiman after the death in 878, the leading role in the area was taken by Malwand ibn Baron al-Ajid, the Galicius, whose family seemed to have come from the areas of northern Portugal. We know little about his power base, but he seems to have been accepted by the Umayyads, and along with the Banu Uqalasim and Ahmed in Upper March, was one of the few Mahommeds to play an important role in the politics of Al-Andalus. His family became quite established. After his death at the hands of the Bebians and Marwan rivals in 828, Abdul Rashim took the opportunity to assert his control, sending troops to occupy Merida in 830 and appointed one of the Umayyad Mawai as governor. He built a citadel which still survives, in an inscription recorded that it was constructed by the governor Abdul al-Bi Khalud bi Thalaman and his Mawai. Ja'far bi Masif, the architecture. In 835 as a stronghold for the Umayyad supporters, Malik al-Khalisi, in the area. The archaeological and literary evidence comes together here to demonstrate both the reality and weakness of the emir's attempts to assert his authority. The fortress was impressive, but how far did the Umayyads' control extend beyond its walls? Away from Merida itself, rebels were still active, and the area was to slip out of the Umayyad grasp after his death, which isn't unusual really, because the Umayyads really had quite a bit of difficulty controlling northern Spain. The middle marches were centred on Toledo. Again, there had been little Arab settlements here, and the dominant groups in the populations of the old capital city were Melowins, who wished to keep power in the city in their own hands. Outside the city walls, it seemed that the upland plains and mountains were dominated by Bebian shepherd tribes. It may have been that rather than people of the cities who the Fedras appealed to in their struggle, the Umayyads, in the late 8th century, according to tradition, widely reported in Arab sources, Al-Hakim I sent his son Abdullah Rashmin to reduce the city, and he summoned their leaders to meet him and had them executed at the Day of Trenches in 797. Recent research suggests that the story is legendary and in fact borrowed from Eastern sources describing a total different incident. This is entirely plausible because we find that the poetry, which is all we have left of these records, tends to mix both Eastern poetry and Western poetry. So we are drawing our historical referentations, a lot of it from things like the Chronicles of Al-Andalus, and the Chronicles is a set of poetry. So this makes it difficult to critique. Well, anyway, that's my 10 minutes for the Al-Andalus part 11, and I wish you the absolute best, and I will be back, I hope, later. Alhamdulillah.